This episode of My Weird Record Collection discusses one or more records that have religious content. Having said that, nothing said in this episode, or any other episode of this podcast for that matter, is meant to be interpreted as promotion, rejection, or mockery of any religious views, or lack thereof.
Father, is it wrong to kiss a girl seriously? No, I think it would be wrong to kiss a girl foolishly.
Hello, my friends. Goodbye, my enemies. Welcome to episode number 23 of My Weird Record Collection. I'm Sean, and I'm coming to you from the great city of Chicago. And consider this your invitation to my odd world of strange, miscellaneous, and uncategorizable media for your turntable. And mine too, I guess. Anyway, in today's episode, we're going to be examining teenagers' questions about life, love, and sex. Which reminds me of a comment that a listener had after the previous episode, and I quote, "One interesting byproduct of MWRC, that's the abbreviation for My Weird Record Collection, of course, is that you get to meet, in quotation marks, so many interesting characters. I'm probably not alone in never having heard of Chuck Eisenman, Glenn W. Turner and his castle, etc. Well, I responded to this comment, and I quote, "Wait till you meet next month's interesting character." That character? Father Francis Lad Filas S.J. That's right, answers to teens' questions about love and sex from a Catholic priest. But before I talk about that, I want to make a possible correction. I talked before about promo records and the ups and downs, mostly ups, of having them. And by the way, I was recently at a record store. I don't remember if it was Lori's Planet of Sound in Chicago or Rediscover Records in Elgin, Illinois, when I was flipping through the singles, and there were a lot of promo records, none that I was interested in. But there were a lot of promo records with the same prices as their equivalent commercial non-promo versions. And I thought, man, this is pretty cool. If you like promo records, this is a good place to be. My guess is that somebody worked at a radio station and that was their stash, and it ended up being up for resale. But the thing about promo records, though, I might have talked about how I found in my dad's collection Rick-a-Tick by the Fireballs with Yacky Doo on the B-side, and that it was a promo record. How did I know it was a promo record? Well, our old friend Discogs.com, the Wikipedia of audio-video collectors. Because, though, it's essentially well, it's not the same as Wikipedia, but it kind of works in the same concept in that anybody can make changes to it. The problem with that is we are relying on other people's knowledge and trusting their info. The label variation from my dad's copy of the Fireballs record was listed as a promo in the Discogs.com database. Well, one day, not too long ago, sometime after I recorded that episode, I got an email notification from Discogs.com that said, hey, here's a comment on an entry that's in your collection. And the comment read something like, why is this labeled a promo? And I looked at the comment history in the entry, and there were some other comments from before that said, I don't think this is a promo. This shouldn't be labeled as a promo and all that. So I wondered, okay, well then why is this label white with red text when all the other top rank international records that are not promos red with white text? But I think I know why somebody tagged it as a promo. It's because the promo records that are definitely promo records in the database on the top rank international label are indeed white labels with red text. But they also say, I think, promotional copy or demonstration copy or something on the label. It is clearly marked on the label as a promotional copy. This copy of Rickatic and Yacky Doo does not have such a notation on it anywhere. So chances are it's just another Top Rank International label variation. So to answer my question from before as to how in the world my dad got a hold of a promo copy, he probably didn't. Plain and simple. Now that I've taken care of all that, my friends, let's take a look at this episode's feature. Teenagers' questions about life, love, and sex. But actually, even before we do that, let's take a look at the man behind the record, the Reverend Francis Filas. Now, my friends, before I go any further, I have to offer this disclaimer. Those of you who are listening shortly after the release of this episode, which for those of you listening in the future was October 15th, 2025, Father Filas spent most of his professional life at Loyola University in Chicago. Now, shortly before this episode was released was the death of the beloved Sister Jean Dolores Schmidt at age 106, who was the athletic chaplain at Loyola University. I promise you, this was a coincidence. I had this episode planned since at least September 15th, 2025. I had the album selected. I had everything laid out. This is only a coincidence. I was not building this upon the death of Sister Jean, may she rest in peace, but about Father Francis Lad Filas S.J. He was born June 4th, 1950 in Cicero, Illinois, which explains his thick Chicago-ish accent on the album.
Actually, as far as temperament goes, it starts somewhere about 6th grade.
Those of you not familiar with the Chicago area, Cicero is just outside of Chicago on the southwest border, really. He was ordained on June 13th, 1945, and he earned a bachelor's degree in philosophy. Then he taught at Jesuit high schools in Cleveland and Detroit. Among the subjects that he taught, Latin, English, math, and music, the latter most likely because music runs in his family, his brother Thomas being a composer. Father Filas earned a master's degree in philosophy at Loyola University, and he became an assistant professor in the theology department at Loyola in 1950, and by 1961 he was a full professor. Filas earned a doctorate in sacred theology in 1952 at Bellarmine Pontifical University in West Baden Springs, Indiana, and his thesis covered the fatherhood of Saint Joseph. In fact, one of his main scholarly interests was in Saint Joseph, and Filas published 7 books about Joseph. He was a big fan of the, well, as it were, the stepfather of Christ. He was a dean at Loyola for 8 years. Father Francis Filas, was a dean at Loyola for 8 years, not St. Joseph by any means. He never set foot in this continent. Anyway, Father Filas became interested in the Shroud of Turin, or is it Turin? Hold on a sec, let me check. You know what it was? It was my 7th grade teacher who pronounced it Turin. It's actually Turin. But those of you who don't know what the Shroud of Turin was, there was a burial shroud found, I believe, in Turin, Italy in, I think it was 1342 or somewhere in that area. And it was found to have the image of somebody buried who was likely crucified. And a huge belief is that it was the shroud used to bury Jesus Christ after his crucifixion, because there were blood marks that could have come from, say, the wounds that he suffered on the cross and during his walk with his cross. And scientists have examined it for centuries, and it doesn't appear that things were painted on by any, at least modern, brush techniques. And one interesting finding at some point was that there were blood marks coming from the wrists even though it was widely believed that when Christ was nailed to the cross, he was nailed by the palms of his hands. That's how it was depicted in works of art, at least. But experiments with cadavers shown that if you really did try to nail somebody up through the palms would not be able to support the weight of the body. However, if you did it through the wrists, the body weight would be supported. So if Christ was indeed crucified with nails, the nails would have gone through his wrists. And apparently there have been crucifixions other than Christ's, whether or not you believe that Christ actually existed and was crucified or whatever else, who were indeed crucified with nails rather than being tied to the cross. And the nails did indeed go through the wrists, according to some archaeological findings. So having said that, at the very least, I think it is concurred that the shroud was a real burial shroud for somebody who was crucified with nails, but nobody has come up with definitive proof that it was that of Christ. They did some radiocarbon dating on the shroud, and according to the carbon dating results, the shroud was made sometime in the 1200s, but there are some scientists who argue that there were some other factors that may have skewed the results of the carbon date, like something might have gotten in the way of getting a truly accurate result. But anyway, back to Father Filas and his interest in the shroud. Starting in 1951, he would do an annual Good Friday broadcast on the ABC network about the Shroud of Turin, and he would do so for many years on Good Friday. One source says it was 20 years, another said it was over 30 years. So I don't know. If you know, great, let me know. Now, when Father Filas was examining pictures of the Shroud of Turin in 1979, he saw what he thought was an inscription from a small coin on one of the eyes of the body that was buried with the shroud. The inscription was the letters UCAI. Now, Filas and numismatics expert Mario Moroni believed that it was from a lepton coin minted in 29 AD, or CE, if you will, during the reign of Pontius Pilate over Judea. The letters UCAI would have been part of an inscription that I'm not going to bother to try to pronounce this thing because it doesn't look even Latin to me. But the full inscription was in all capital letters, TIBEPIOU, and then another word, CAICAPOC. So the UCAI would have come from part of that first word and part of the second word. There are skeptics, however, who say that those coins would have actually read TIBEPOYKICAPOC, and that putting coins over the eyes of the dead was not a Jewish custom at the time. So there goes that theory, right? Now, we're going to step away from the Shroud of Turin. I'll put a couple of links in the show notes in case you want to read more. It does get pretty fascinating. But going back to Father Filas, he was awarded Israel's Terra Sancta medal during a trip to Jerusalem. It was either in late 1965 or early 1966. I couldn't definitively determine. And here's a fun fact about Father Filas. He appeared in the 1970 movie Hollywood Blue, starring Mickey Rooney and a couple of other famous names. There's a thing about it. He did not know he was in that movie until somebody in Los Angeles recognized him and told him, "Hey, I saw you in this movie, Hollywood Blue." So Father Filas watched the movie when he was in New York City in early 1971, and he indeed recognized himself. According to the Chicago Tribune, there was footage of him from a TV series from the mid-60s. The series was sponsored by the Society of Jesus, and that footage appeared after a scene in a nude nightclub and before a scene with a couple of naked women on a beach. He also recognized himself before a scene depicting a couple having a sexual encounter in bed. So Father Filas sued Graffiti Productions and the film's distributors. Of course, Graffiti Productions is the company who made the film. He sued them for $1 million on the basis of invasion of privacy. His lawsuit also demanded that his footage be removed from the film. He said the furthest thing from his mind was concern that it might have been considered a dirty movie. He just didn't want his footage in there. Thought that was interesting. But anyway, Father Filas died in his sleep on February 15th, 1985. I tried to get some more information about Father Filas. I posted on a couple of Chicago Facebook groups asking if anybody remembered him or knew him, but I got no responses other than a like react. Aside from Father Filas publishing a bunch of books, he also published other albums besides the one I'm talking about here. In 1964, he also released The Battle of the Sexes, ... Can It Be Avoided? Sex Education of Children for Parents, and Who's the Boss? You or Your Children? Ooh. In 1965, he released an album called Tips for Adoptive Parents, and then in 1969, he released an album called Getting Along with Your Teenager. Some of these albums are double record sets, some are single, by the way. I have none of the other ones. I can tell you this much, though. Every one of those albums has the exact same front cover picture. But right now, we're going to talk about one of the ones he released in 1964, and as I said earlier, that album is a 2-record set called Teenagers' Questions about life, love, and sex. So let's check out what's on that album, shall we? In talking about the records for this podcast, I like to talk about their physical appearances, especially because this is a audio podcast primarily. The only thing is, I think this time I'm going to start rather with the contents of the album rather than the physical appearance. And even before that, there is something I have to explain. Many of you already know this, but I can't assume that everybody does. Not everybody has experience with the Catholic Church. Well, you're listening to a guy who went to Catholic grade school, Catholic high school, Catholic college, and technically Catholic grad school too. So I know a little bit here, and one thing I do know, I remind you, the name of this album is Teenagers' Questions about life, love, and sex. These questions are being answered by Father Francis Lad Filas. Francis Filas was a Catholic priest. One thing you ought to know about Catholic priests, they are not allowed to be married. And neither are Catholic brothers, actually. That reminds me of a time when one day I was out at the grocery store and I happened to bump into one of the brothers who I had as a teacher in high school. And I said, "Hey, Brother Rich, how you doing, man?" He said, "Oh, Sean, good to see you. I'm here with my lady." And I said, "Wait, your lady? Are you allowed?" And he interrupted me and said, "Tut, tut, tut." I remember one time in 7th grade, our religion teacher posed us this minor brain teaser. She said, "Is it possible for someone to receive all 7 sacraments?" In the Catholic Church, there are 7 recognized sacraments. I believe Protestant churches only recognize 3, but Catholics recognize 7. And one of the sacraments is holy orders, which is basically when you become ordained to be a priest. Also, matrimony or marriage is a sacrament. So how could you have both? Well, yeah, it is possible that you can have all 7 sacraments. And that would be if you have been married and at some point your wife dies and you later become a priest. So that is one possibility. The other possibility, I guess, would be if you leave the priesthood either by your own choice or you get defrocked and then later on get married, although I don't know if the Catholic Church would recognize that marriage. I don't know. I'm not that well-versed myself. So, of course, naturally, it's weird that you have a Catholic priest answering questions about sex, which the priest is not allowed to participate in. He's supposed to be celibate. And, of course, love. And by love, we're talking about a romantic relationship, which priests are also not allowed to partake in. If you ever look down and see what looks like a wedding ring on a priest's hand, that kind of sort of is a wedding ring, if I'm not mistaken. It's to symbolize that that priest is married to the church. That's why they're not allowed to be married, because they are supposed to be dedicated entirely to the church without dividing attention to a wife and offspring. I might be not technically correct about that, and I'm sure I will get some feedback if I'm not. But getting that out of the way, let's talk about what is on these two records. That's right, it is a 2-record set, 12 inches. Now, I did not record the parts of this podcast episode in order. You're going to hear me later say that this album clocks in at almost 2 hours. That's not correct. It goes just seconds beyond 90 minutes in total. But the record consists of Father Filas addressing an audience, I think of about 150 people, and they're all teenagers, probably a few adults here and there. Now, I gotta say, despite all that I said about Catholic priests and marriage and sex and everything, it seems to me, judging by the applause he got, how the kids reacted to the things he said, and the raucous ovation he got afterwards, complete with whistling and everything, the kids obviously respected Father Filas. There was something about him that they really liked. And it made me think of when I went through confirmation when I was in 7th grade. They had a nun talk to us about love and sex. It was Sister Jesuina. And I remember particularly we all adored her because she didn't talk down to us, and she had a wicked sense of humor on top of that. And she spoke at our 8th grade graduation banquet. And I remember she said, "I'm often asked if it bothers me that I'm called the sex nun. No, that doesn't bother me at all. What would bother me is if somebody called me the sexy nun." So just to give you an idea of that, and Father Filas kind of reminded me of Sister Jesuina in a few ways. Of course, Catholic nuns also are not allowed to have romantic relationships, and they're supposed to be celibate and everything. But getting back to Father Filas, the very first thing we hear on the record is he introduces the subject of his talk. First, a discussion of sex education and family life education, and then second, and what is more than half of this album, a Q&A with the questions provided anonymously from pieces of paper handed out to the audience, encouraging the teenagers in the crowd to ask anything they want.
But I want your questions to be anonymous, and if you can't spell, make an anonymous, which means I'll try and wade through your spelling any way it goes.
Basically, Father Filas demystifies the fact that they're teenagers and that being a teenager matters in the long run as to the importance of their thoughts, their questions, their attitudes. And he implies that the only thing that you really need to know about teenagers is that they're human beings. They're no less important than adults. In other words, he's telling the crowd that they are being taken seriously as young adults and that they deserve human dignity.
So often, people get the idea that the teenager is some sort of addle-pated, mutton-headed, fat-headed idiot that can think of nothing serious and all the rest.
Now, Father Filas complained about adults misunderstanding what sex education is about, and he discussed the knee-jerk reaction of an adult he knew who pulled a child from a class because in that class they were going to show supposedly a film about sex, but it turned out to be a film about the birth of a buffalo. And Father Francis, I'm going to switch off, call him Father Francis now and then, Father Filas now and then. But Father Francis spends a lot of time talking about the differences between males and females.
Give a watch to a little boy. What does he do? Out comes a screwdriver. Take it apart. Give a watch to a little girl. What does she do? She puts a ribbon on it.
How they make decisions, how they dress, such as how males tended to wear darker colors and they dressed pretty similarly, yet girls would die if they saw other girls dressed the same as they are. He talked about what kids being concerned about being good versus bad, but that really the only thing you need to worry about is hygiene, because everybody has something good to offer. He talks about the differences between loving someone and liking someone. Short and to the point, liking someone is beyond your control, but loving someone takes effort, takes control, and whatever else have you. So after talking for about 21 minutes, Father Filas explained that even though he had just been talking about really the difference between males and females and the difference between liking and loving, He actually was talking about sex education the whole time, specifically a concept called temperamental sexuality, and that he was also going to be talking about what he called genital sexuality, the sexuality within a particular relationship toward bringing new life into the world on the female side and begetting new life on the male side. And also in this part of the conversation, Father Filas gives me an opportunity to drop in an audio clip totally out of context because apparently my maturity level and sense of humor are that of an 8-year-old boy.
My body is good, my body is beautiful, my body is noble, and all the parts of my body, my reproductive organs, are just as noble and beautiful and good as every other part of my body.
But in all seriousness, this quote is an example of Father Filas approaching sex education in a positive way, because too many people had the idea that certain parts of the human anatomy, that is genitalia, are dirty and shouldn't be talked about. And that's the end of side 1, kind of ends almost abruptly, and the talk about genital sexuality continues when you put on side 2. Father Filas says that all the parts of the body should be regarded as good because, well, they're made by God. He laments that corporations profit off teenagers by using sex as bait. Everybody's doing it. But he counters with how these corporations don't count on the large number of people who are full of goodness and, in Father Filas's words, understand that sexual intercourse before marriage does not work, and that intercourse is actually symbolism through God, explaining this.
Now, what is the symbolism of sexual intercourse? It's the bodily way for one man to tell one woman, I completely give myself to you with absolutely nothing held back, and I accept your complete gift of yourself to me with nothing held back. And this is why it works in marriage. This is why it cannot work outside marriage. Oh, I admit it's misused. You've heard about it all over. But it can be misused as a symbol of hate. Sexual intercourse could be misused as a symbol of selfishness, where a man would use a woman or a woman would use a man just for all I could get out of the other party. And that's exactly the complete misuse of a magnificent, beautiful symbolism God put in us.
He laments how sometimes teenagers seek any seemingly private place, like the backseat of a car maybe, so they can go off and have sex. They have a feeling of guilt in the back of their minds the entire time. They have a fear of being caught, and all for a fleeting moment that ends up not having the deep meaning that the act of sexual intercourse is intended to have. He transitions from the importance of marriage for sex to work to talking about the importance of understanding the permanence of marriage and all the ups and downs that come with it. Sick kids to deal with, leaky roofs, putting up with each other's occasional grumpiness, etc., and to not forget that it's important for the kids in the family to feel love. Father Filas again laments, this time, that if kids don't feel they're getting love at home, they may seek out the slightest, most meaningless kiss or even more from someone else just to have some kind of attention. He talks about how important it is in these cases for kids' peers to be simply there for them, and how the simplest acts can mean a lot to those who don't feel they're getting love at home. And for those who don't get love at home, he recommends doing the same thing. If you're not getting the love, give it to someone else. Show people you appreciate them. Be there for your peers. And Father Francis explained that in sex education, it's important that if someone asks a question, that person deserves an answer appropriate for that person's age. He emphasizes that there are no such things as dirty parts of the body that you need to use a slang term for, because by doing that, you're basically saying that what you do with those body parts is something inherently dirty or bad, which it's not, and that every body part deserves to be referred to by its proper name. He points out how we don't really have slangy alternatives for, say, arms or legs. So why should we have slangy alternatives for the so-called private parts?
And people so often, in my talks, grown-ups will say, well, gee, I ain't no doctor, I don't know all them big words. You should say, I am no doctor, I don't know all those big words. You don't need a long list. 5 words give you the general idea. Penis for the male generative organ, vagina for female receptacle, womb, egg, and seed. That pretty well covers the main list. And any other thing you'd have, you'd simply be explaining what the organs are. Now, this is sacred.
He emphasizes that sex education should not be seen as shameful, but as something good. He tells the audience that by the time you're in 6th or 7th grade, you should have already been told about things like menstruation and, getting a little graphic here, nocturnal emissions, and other things that they're going to experience when hitting puberty. It should not be a mystery. He says that sex education in school shouldn't contradict sex education at home. The two should actually complement each other, help each other out. He says that if school-based sex education would teach that you and your body are worth something, and that we should be innocent but not ignorant, as he says, a lot of the so-called filth that goes on in the schoolyard would be cleaned out. Now, regarding ignorance, Father Filas cited a statistic that said about 1,200 girls every year leave high school because of pregnancy, and half those pregnant girls got pregnant because they literally did not know they were having sex, because they were never given proper sex education and didn't realize what they were doing. And Father Francis talks about venereal disease, specifically gonorrhea and syphilis. And I use the word lament a lot, and I'm going to use it again here. He laments that people are afraid to talk about the subject, and because those diseases were so prevalent, if they were not venereal diseases, they would have made headline news. But because they're sexually transmitted diseases, nobody wants to talk about them because it's so taboo. He says that talking about these diseases should not be used as a scare tactic, but just to provide the facts, and also to help prevent the innocent from getting these diseases. He talks about how both diseases are curable, but the problem is that those who get it are afraid to seek treatment. He uses syphilis as an example, and he talks in great detail, unfortunately, about the symptoms of the disease and the effects, driving home the importance of getting treatment. And suddenly, without transition,
Things like this are the reasons why we give VD education. And it leads up into a wholesome attitude towards the body, instead of saying just be scared about it. Now we're going to go into the questions that you have.
that might have been how the editing was done. I don't know. He very well might have said right in mid-sentence, now let's answer your questions. But hey, I didn't edit this album. Don't know. But after the transition, you hear a round of applause and then about 6 seconds of silence. And I mean actual audio silence, an audio gap on the record, and not just Father Filas standing there not saying anything. Now, I didn't mention before, but all 4 album sides are just one big track on each of them. They're not banded into subjects or anything. This would have been a great opportunity to put a band in the vinyl, but they didn't do that. But anyway, starting at about 15 and a half minutes into side 2 is when Father Filas begins the Q&A. And interestingly, the audio fidelity is totally different. It's less muffled, and it has a little bit more dynamic equalization. It is possible, theoretically, that Q&A might have been a recording from a different time and venue, or maybe it was a result of changing tapes or something, I don't know. But the rest of the album is Father Filas answering questions anonymously submitted by teenagers in the audience. The first one that I particularly like is when he was answering a question about why our bodies are able to procreate when we're young enough to be just 7th graders, yet we aren't considered old enough to get married until many years later. I like this part of his answer in particular, emphasizing how we need to understand why marriage by no means involves just bringing up a baby.
Marriage is a case of living with another member of the human race, day in and day out. You know what we mean by living day in and day out. It's real wonderful to be the belle of the ball the night before. But remember what she looks like the morning after. And when the Romeo of the night before wakes up the next morning, your local zoo has lost his biggest baboon.
And really, the rest of the album is just that, answering a bunch of questions that teenagers submitted. And something that I noticed about Father Filas, of course, he gets pretty graphic about certain things. What you heard earlier when he was talking about those 5 body parts, that's just the beginning. And yeah, it did feel kind of awkward listening, especially knowing that he's a man of the cloth. But there are some things worth mentioning. First of all, the guy really does know his stuff. He knows the science behind, say, procreating and venereal diseases and things. And at the same time, he does not get shameful and judgy.
When the girls turn in a question, why, how come you're so rough on us on drinking? After all, I go out weekends with our crowds. We take a couple of 6-packs with us, a couple of 6-packs of beer. couple of bottles of wine or a couple of fifths. Doesn't bother me. I said, the only trouble is, girlie, you're an alcoholic already.
Okay, well, he doesn't get shameful and judgy about sex, at least. He doesn't toe the line that many a Catholic parent have yelled at their kids, sex is for married people. It's a sin if you have sex. But he doesn't get like that. He does say that, well, if you're not married, sex doesn't work, and here's why, and here's why it's a gift from God, etc. But he doesn't shame anybody about it. He doesn't come out and say it's a sin. He just says it doesn't work. And he acknowledges that in goodwill, people can still be innocently caught off guard, and before they know it, they're in the middle of sex without even really realizing it. I thought that was interesting that he said that. And also, I do like Father Filas's very straightforward answer to this particular question.
Father, how do you tell a boy to stop? The way you tell a boy to stop is you say, stop.
I do see a tiny bit of hypocrisy going on because, well, Father Francis says this.
May I remind you, these questions are frank. That's what our purpose is. And we never should laugh at somebody else's question.
But then later on, well, explain this, Father Francis. Come on.
Father, how can you get the guts to tell a girl that you like her? I tried to tell her outright, but I couldn't. I've known her now for about 1.5 years. The answer is that...
I don't know. It might have been an inside joke or something. Who knows? Now, interestingly, side 3 reverts to the muffled sound quality from before the Q&A, but that was really it. The rest of the album was just questions and answers, and he was being quite frank. He wasn't sugarcoating anything. He wasn't using euphemisms. He wasn't talking down. He was being quite straightforward, and at the same time, he had a pretty good sense of humor throughout the entire recording. And I think that's really how he seemingly got along with the teenagers that were in the audience. They seemed to really enjoy having him present. They seemed very welcoming. I'm going to disclaim, I don't know where this recording came from. I don't know if it came from multiple sessions or what, or multiple locations. I do know that Father Filas did deliver this same talk multiple times over the years, judging from newspaper articles from after 1964. Like I saw a few from 1969 and the early 70s, in which he was going to be delivering a talk called Teenagers' Questions About Life, Love, and Sex. Now, friends, I always mention that the records that I talk about in this podcast, if they're not already up on YouTube, I will digitize them myself and put them on YouTube. I did the best I could in removing surface noise digitally, so it's a nice clear recording. As the album progressed, it got technically more difficult to do that. So the closer you get to the end of the album, like especially on side 4, the more clicking you're gonna hear that I just could not remove despite my best efforts, so I apologize. I don't think the best care was taken in the production of the album, at least not with the tapes, because there are a couple of spots when you can hear some tape glitches, and in one case you can actually hear kind of the tape all kind of crinkled up or fumbled or twisted or something.
She may be in the blues, and as a matter of fact, you can tell the truth of any emotional reaction by asking yourself.
And that also probably contributed to why certain parts of the album were very difficult to correct digitally. So that is the content of Teenagers' Questions About Life, Love, and Sex. Now, I should actually describe the album. The front cover has the title on top, Teenagers' Questions About Life, Love, and Sex. It's in a serif font. Actually, all the text is in a serif font, all capital letters. There's a picture of Father Filas off to the right. He's wearing a Roman collar and everything. He's holding an open book that I guess we're supposed to assume is a Bible. He is obviously photographed in a library, because in the background there are bookcases with catalog numbers on all the spines of the book. They appear to be Library of Congress catalog format, which would be consistent with a typical college library. So theoretically, the picture could have been taken at the library at Loyola University. In the middle of the cover, there is some text, straightforward answers to teenagers, recorded at an unrehearsed and spontaneous give-and-take meeting by Francis Lad Filas S.J, theologian and family life counselor. On the back cover, there is a photograph. It's all black and, by the way, everything here is black and white. There is no color photography. But there's a picture of Father Filas speaking at a microphone, and in the background you can see some kind of audience. It might be teenagers, most likely is teenagers, and there's a list of, and I quote, other helpful and informative albums by Francis Lad Filas S.J, and it has the albums I mentioned before: Sex Education of Children for Parents, $6.95 postpaid; The Battle of the Sexes, Can It Be Avoided? A witty comparison of masculine and feminine outlooks. That's $5.99 postpaid. Who's the Boss? You or Your Children? Positive Attitudes Toward Parental Authority in the Family, $5.95 postpaid. And Tips for Adoptive Parents, Practical Answers for Parents of the quote-unquote chosen child, $5.95 postpaid. Additional copies of this album, that is Teenagers' Questions About Life, Love, and Sex, may be ordered at $6.95 postpaid from FTE Corporation, Faith Through Education Corporation, P.O. Box 517, Skokie, Illinois 60076. And it has a copyright date MCM LXIV or 1964. So, yeah, it's basically a commercial, really, the back cover. The spine, once again, I think this is the third album in a row in which I checked the spine of the cover, and there's nothing on it. It's blank. It's blank. So again, if you store your records vertically in a shelf of some kind, you won't know which one this is. Now, because this is a double album, thankfully, the makers, the people who manufactured it, were bright enough to make it a gatefold. So that way you have a separate compartment for each record. On the left side of the gatefold, you have just a little paragraph about what exactly Father Filas is talking about here. Oh boy. For a group of 150 teenagers, Father Filas summarizes healthy, positive attitudes, sex education in the home and the school, VD education, dating, kissing, petting, preparation for marriage, drink, premarital sex, experimentation, maturity, etc. About the speaker. So here's a biography of Father Filas. And oh boy, all rights reserved. This album or any part thereof may not be broadcast without written permission of the FTE Corp. On the right side of the gatefold, there are more pictures of Father Filas addressing people with some captions. This is no canned studio lecture, but one developed by Father Filas in talks before audiences in dozens of cities, etc. This recording is ideal for individual fathers and mothers who are worried about the problem of explaining sex to their teens. Ooh. As you will hear, Father Filas tells how sex education can be successfully accomplished with a positive, yet extremely relaxed and equally realistic approach. Sounds promising, doesn't it? Now, as for the records, I mentioned before, this is a 2-record set. Interestingly, this 2-record set is configured for stackers, which means that Disc 1 has side 1 and side 4, and Disc 2 has side 2 and side 3. So what you would do is first you would put side 1 on the spindle, on the stacker, and then put side 2 on top of that. So that way when you play through both of those records on your automatic changer, all you have to do is pick the 2 records up and flip the stack over without reorganizing the records to hear this in the intended order. There's only one band on each side, and the record label is kind of a maroonish, dark maroonish label, pretty plain, and the text is in silver text on the top, kind of following the curve of the label. It says a Faith Through Education record. Underneath that, in straight horizontal text, FTE Records, and then below that, above the spindle hole, Teenagers' Questions About Life, Love, and Sex. On the far left of the spindle hole on the label, you have the catalog number. On the far right by the spindle hole, it has the side indicator, and then under the spindle hole, it says by Francis Filas S.J. The S.J. being an indication, by the way, that he is a Jesuit priest. On the bottom third of the label, it says long play 33 and a third, and then it has a couple of more serial numbers. And on the very bottom of the label, following the curve of the label, it says a product of FTE Corp. Now, I know that these two records were manufactured at the RCA record plant in Indianapolis. How do I know that? If you look in the dead wax, as they call it, or the run-out groove at the end of the record near the label, and you hold it up to light, you'll see there are some etchings on the vinyl, including the catalog number and everything, and all by itself, a capital letter I, which indicates that the record was pressed at RCA's Indianapolis record plant. And a fun fact, if you want to be that level of record detective, if you have a record that was pressed at RCA's Rockaway, New Jersey plant, it would have a capital letter R etched in the dead wax. And speaking of RCA records, Sean's record collecting thoughts is on the same subject of RCA records. So here's what I have to say about that. In the 90s, when I was really starting to get into collecting records, I started hearing about sought-after records with a particular RCA label variation, the oft-discussed Shaded Dog. These RCA labels were called Shaded Dogs because the background behind Nipper the dog and the gramophone he was listening to was a slightly darker color than the background of the rest of the red label. I didn't know what the big deal was. All I knew was that they were a big deal, but I'd never seen one, just regular old RCA labels with Nipper in full bright color. And honestly, I don't think it was until sometime in the 2010s when I finally saw one. It was, a label, a red label, and Nipper and the record player had a darker background. The asking price of the record was, no more than any other record, really. But wait a second, aren't these things supposed to be highly sought after and collectible? I mean, what's the deal? Well, from what I learned, when record collectors talk about Shaded Dogs, they're specifically referring to RCA's so-called Living Stereo series of classical records. Actually, I'm finding that even mono records might have Shaded Dog labels. The thing is, I always had heard of the Living Stereo series, I just never encountered a Shaded Dog label until I was well into my adulthood. Even as a teenager, though, I was knowledgeable enough that I could look at an RCA catalog number on a stereo record and notice that it started LS, which I assumed was a sly little reference to the Living Stereo series. I noticed that on the Broadway cast recording of Hair, for example, whose catalog was LSO 1150, and the off-Broadway cast recording of Hair from the previous year, which was LSO 1143, the mono catalog number was LOC 1143. Then you have Surrealistic Pillow by Jefferson Airplane, catalog number LSP 3766 in stereo, LPM 3766 in mono. Using my sense of reasoning, I concluded that the O stands for original cast recording, and P stands for popular. But what was up with these mono albums? Why wouldn't the mono off-Broadway Hair cast recording be LMO 1143 and the mono Surrealistic Pillow LMP 3766? All I can think is that the L is just RCA's identifying initial, again a reference to Living Stereo, and the next two letters would define the genre, OC for original cast and PM for popular music. So why the sudden shift if it's a stereo record? My guess is that RCA wanted to keep the alphabetic prefix to 3 letters, and that the second letter would now indicate that it's stereo, and the genre abbreviation would be pushed one space to the right, and now it would become a single letter abbreviation. Ergo, O would mean original cast, P would mean popular music. which of course means that the quadraphonic version of the Broadway cast recording of Hair would be catalog LQO 1150, right? Guess again. It's ABD10245, and I'm not even going to try to break that one apart. But back to that shaded dog. What's the big deal about the shaded dog? Well, apparently, the original Shaded Dog releases of certain albums had significantly better sound than their later pressings with the so-called Dynagroove RCA mastering or on the so-called White Dog pressings. The White Dogs are reportedly easier on the dynamics and the lows, which would theoretically make it easier for the stylist to track, but it would also be a little bit of a downgrade in sound quality. Also, Shaded Dogs were supposedly pressed on quieter vinyl, while the later pressings were on grainier sounding vinyl. So what made me bring up this whole Shaded Dog thing in the first place? Well, to be quite honest with you, I was having a hard time coming up with a topic for Sean's record collecting thoughts for this episode until I was at Laurie's Planet of Sound on the north side of Chicago and found a copy of Peter and the Commissar, an album that Alan Sherman recorded with Arthur Fiedler and the Boston Pops Orchestra. You don't see that album out in the wild much, and the cost was only $8, so I grabbed it. And wouldn't you know it, it's a Shaded Dog. My copy is mono, though, so I can't experience the living stereo, as it's called. Now, I have many records on the RCA label in my collection, but this is my only Shaded Dog. So how does it sound in comparison with my other RCAs? Well, it's hard to say because, well, this Alan Sherman record, Peter and the Commissar, got a lot of love by its previous owner or owners because it has a lot of surface noise. Even after a good cleaning in my spin clean device, it's loaded with pops and scratches. Thankfully, it still plays all the way through and it's listenable, but it's just all scratchy sounding. I do have to say, it does indeed sound quite dynamic. The bass response on the timpanis really packs a punch, and the trebles are nice and bright. So, no complaints, other than the surface noise, of course. But at least the next time I find myself in a room full of record collecting nerds, which I don't think I've been in quite a long time, I can now proudly claim to own a Shaded Dog. Alright, some stuff I have to go over just in case there are some brand new listeners listening to this episode and it's their first ever listen to this podcast. I like to rate the records that I talk about on this podcast, and each one gets a rating on a scale of 1 through 5 inclusive on 5 factors, meaning each record will have a composite score of somewhere between 5 and 25, again inclusive. First, I rate based on either local interest or usefulness, or once in a while I'll do kind of a combination of the two. That's the first rating. The next rating I do is historical interest. I determine whether or not the record is of historical, interest, I guess, whether it's a sign of the time in which it was recorded and released. The other factors that I rate on are uniqueness, weirdness, and enjoyability. So let's talk about that first thing, local interest or usefulness. Even though Father Filas spent most of his life in and around Chicago, and his prominent Great Lakes regional accent really sticks out, there's nothing at all provincial about the album. And in fact, in his closing remarks, he kind of implies that the target audience is beyond the Chicago regional area. In fact, we don't even know where he even recorded this. He talks about how hundreds of thousands of teenagers are going to hear what he has to say thanks to the recording he was making of his talk. So that means I have to rate the usefulness of the album and not the historical interest. And that's going to be tough. Keep in mind, this album is from 1964, and ergo 1964 cultural and ethical standards are your reference points here. However, we're also talking the Catholic Church, whose stance on at least sex hasn't really changed much since, even after the Second Vatican Council the following year. I would imagine that given the target audience, this album was quite useful for at least Catholic teenagers who wanted to comply with church rules. In that case, the record could be quite handy. But yet I can't get past the fact that the person on these two records of the album, the person who is giving advice on love and sex, is a Catholic priest. I remind you again, my friends, that except for very rare circumstances, a Catholic priest is not allowed to have much experience in this regard. And believe me, Catholic teenagers are well aware of this. Maybe it's just this guy talking, but man, if I want advice about love and sex, the last person I'm going to see is someone who's not allowed to partake in either. So, sorry to do this, but I have to rate the usefulness of the album just kind of wishy-washy. Actually, wait a minute. Now that I think of it, Father Filas honestly did offer a lot of truly good advice, speaking as someone who's been happily married for over 26 years. So you know what? What the hey? I'll give the album a 4 out of 5 for usefulness. Let's move on to historical interest. Honestly, I can't say this is necessarily of much historical interest unless you knew Father Francis or are interested in his various works. Maybe there's a little sign of the times in that he throws out the term venereal disease, which at least since I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, we didn't use that term. We used the names of the actual diseases that fall under that umbrella. Chlamydia, syphilis, gonorrhea, tragically AIDS, and among other things. Even then, the only venereal diseases Father Filas specifies are syphilis and gonorrhea. And a quick check in a search engine tells me that chlamydia in humans was not recognized as a sexually transmitted disease until the 70s. Hence, it wouldn't be mentioned in Filas's talk anyway. He also made no mentions of contraception of any kind. It could be that birth control pills were still a new thing, which they were, and back then condoms just weren't really talked about much publicly. Or it could be also that, to this day, the Catholic Church frowns upon using drugs or devices for contraception and instead recommends more natural methods, such as, well, nowadays, the symptothermic method, which wasn't a thing till 1965. And of course, the materials necessary for the symptothermic method would likely only be available to adults. But the more I talk about it, the more I think this album is a good representation of the times of 1964. So, heck with it, I'll give the historical interest rating 4 out of 5. Now, the uniqueness rating of the album. Well, on one hand, it seems unusual that you would look toward an audio recording for advice on love and sex, but really in 1964, it wasn't that unheard of, as you'll find out in a future episode of this podcast, spoiler alert. But what about the uniquity? Oh, shut up, Redline. This is a totally valid word, perfectly cromulent. What about the uniquity of this exact title? Well, it's findable if you want a copy. As of the time I'm recording this, there are 4 copies available on Discogs.com, 1 for $6, and the other 3 are starting at 50 clams. Good grief. I saw 3 copies on eBay for under $20. 52 Discogs users, including me, claim to have this album. I said the album is findable, but half the copies have price tags of $50 and up, so maybe it's not so easy to find? Oh, goodness. You know, I hate doing this, but I'll go halvesies on the uniqueness rating and give it 3 out of 5. And what, my friends, is the name of this podcast? My weird record collection, which tells me that we should discuss the weirdness of this album. Correct? Correct. So let's see here. The name of the album is Teenagers' Questions About Life, Love, and Sex. Prominently on the cover is a Catholic priest, complete with the Roman collar, and said Catholic priest, indeed, is the one disseminating the wisdom about these topics. And we have just 10 minutes shy of 2 hours of advice from a Catholic priest. Again, I just cannot get past a Catholic priest being presented as an authority on this stuff. And no, don't give me that, well, somebody could be married and widowed and then later become a priest after the wife dies. No, that is not what happened with Father Filas. I just find it weird, okay? But at the same time, I can't automatically slap a rating of 5 out of 5 for weirdness just based on that, especially because, again, he actually does give a lot of helpful advice. So you know what? Let's rate it a 4. How about that? Finally, perhaps the most important part of owning a record is, do you enjoy it? So let's talk about that. I don't know who actually sits down wanting to hear someone talking about romantic relationships and sex, and I especially don't know who would actually specifically want to hear about it from a man of the cloth who isn't allowed to partake in either. But I gotta say, I cannot tank the enjoyability rating of this album. Father Filas presents himself in a very engaging, straightforward, and often humorous way.
Father, what do you think of nudist colonies? My answer to that, I think nudist colonies are a bare fact.
I have to admit, when I first listened to the album, I could not wait to have material to make fun of, but I was quite surprised by what I heard. Sonically, it's not the greatest sounding recording ever, and mind you, when I'm in the mood to crank out some sounds in the living room, Father Filas' album is not going to be my first or second or third or fourth or fifth choice. But damn it if it's not actually an enjoyable listen, so I'll give it 4 out of 5 for enjoyability. So let's tally up the composite rating. 4 out of 5 for usefulness, 4 for historical interest, 3 for uniqueness, 4 for weirdness, and 4 for enjoyability, which gives Teenagers' Questions About Life, Love, and Sex a composite rating of 19 out of 25, placing it in a 3-way tie with Your Favorites by the Singing Johnson Family and They're at the Post. So if I'm going to rank the Father Filas album with the other titles here, then I would have to put it 1 notch below the Singing Johnson Family album and 1 above They're at the Post. I'd probably rather listen to people singing in harmony than to listen to a guy lecture about life, love, and sex. But I would rather listen to that than say They're at the Post, which, for one thing, is supposed to be a game, and another thing, can get pretty repetitive. I'll tell you about next month's episode, but before I do, I'll tell you where you can send your thoughts about this podcast, and I will, of course, give credit where credit is due. My email address is myweirdrecords@fab4it.com. Fab4it is spelled F-A-B, the number 4-I-T. And that's almost identical to the website for My Weird Record Collection, where you can get current and previous episodes on the podcast and the corresponding show notes and some other goodies. And that website, put this into your web browser, myweirdrecords.fab4it.com. While you're there, hey, consider clicking on the link that says Buy Me a Coffee. You do that and you can donate a few bucks toward keeping this podcast going. Even though it says Buy Me a Coffee, I'm not going to have coffee, or at least if I get coffee, I'm not going to drink it because I do not like coffee. You can also find me on the various social networks where my handle is My Weird Records, and you can look for this podcast on Facebook as well. Just do a search for My Weird Record Collection when you're in Facebook, or in your favorite web browser, you can go directly to facebook.com/myweirdrecords. My Weird Record Collection can also be accessed on YouTube, and on YouTube you'll find not only episodes of this podcast with some visual aid to go along with it, but also, whenever possible, audio of the records that I discuss and occasional bonus videos about my weird and my not weird record collections. So go to YouTube and search My Weird Record Collection, or go directly to youtube.com/@My Weird Record Collection. By the way, sounds and music used in this podcast remain the property of their respective copyright holders, and they are used for commentary and review. Infringement is not intended. And now for the credit where credit is due, the special thanks that I love to give, first of all, to Tim Christ, also known as Shoebox, also known as Worm Quartet, who was actually seen briefly on the evening news on WGN recently. Thank you, Tim, for letting me use your record, the Pac-Man EP, as the basis for the logo of this podcast. Tim and his You're Never Gonna Believe It Until You Hear It music, and you better hear it, can be found on his website at worm-quartet.web.app. Also, a big hug and thanks to my friend Kevin Zerby for designing the logo artwork for this podcast. Check out Kevin and his music and his podcasts on the web at zerbinator.com. I also extend a huge thanks to Laurie's Planet of Sound in Chicago and Cow Records in San Diego. You both know what for. Now, the next episode is happening in November, and November, well, as anybody who's ever seen a Charlie Brown Thanksgiving will tell you, has Thanksgiving, and what's one tradition of Thanksgiving? The Thanksgiving football game. And there's also a special anniversary in November, and that is the anniversary of the first ever collegiate American gridiron football game between Princeton University and Rutgers University. So we're going to have an episode to commemorate that, maybe even a little bit more, coming on November 15th, unless, of course, stupid things get in the way. But until then, this is Sean reminding you, support your local record store, and please take care of your mental health. Bye-bye.
She is very, very lovey-dovey, very oochie-coochie, smoochy and all the rest, if you follow my lingo, my Russian. Well, anyway,